The air in Louisiana in 1858 was a thick, living thing, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the cloying sweetness of sugar cane. It clung to the skin, seeped into the very fabric of existence, and often it carried secrets. But no secret was quite as profoundly unsettling, quite as fundamentally wrong as the one discovered beneath the grand, decaying elegance of Bellechasse Plantation. Imagine, if you will, a child. Not a ghost, not a whisper of memory, but a living, breathing human being, found not in a field, not wandering a road, but in the suffocating darkness beneath the very floorboards of a sprawling antebellum home. Alone. For how long? No one could say. What did she eat? What did she drink? How did she survive the rats, the snakes, the oppressive humidity, the sheer crushing isolation? The questions piled up like the Spanish moss on ancient oaks, each one heavier than the last, each one hinting at a deeper, more terrifying truth. This wasn't a tale of a child lost in the woods or a runaway found hiding in a barn. This was a child who had, by some impossible means, made a home in the forgotten space between the earth and the foundations of a house filled with people who claimed to know every soul on their vast property. And the most chilling question of all, why had no one reported her missing? Why had no one searched for her? The very idea of it, a small, silent life existing in the unseen void beneath their feet, was enough to curdle the blood, to make the grandest halls feel like the most desolate of tombs. It was a discovery that would unravel more than just a mystery. It would unravel the very fabric of what the Vauquelin family believed they knew about their world and about themselves. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound horrors are not those that scream, but those that simply are, existing in the quiet, forgotten corners of human indifference. Before we go any further into what happened at Bellechasse Plantation, drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. And if you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. We post new stories every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to Louisiana, 1858. Bellechasse Plantation was not merely a collection of buildings. It was an empire carved from the fertile, unforgiving soil of Louisiana. Situated on the western bank of the mighty Mississippi, roughly 40 miles south of Baton Rouge, its sprawling fields of sugarcane stretched for miles, a verdant, whispering sea under the relentless summer sun. The main house, a grand two-story structure with wide verandas and towering white columns, had once been the epitome of French Creole elegance. Now, in 1858, a subtle decay had begun to set in, a faint peeling of paint, a slight tilt to a shutter, a persistent dampness in the air that even the strongest breezes from the river couldn't quite dispel. The scent of molasses, thick and sweet from the nearby sugar mill, mingled with the earthy aroma of the river and the faint metallic tang of the cane fields, creating a unique, almost intoxicating perfume that defined Bellechasse. Armand Vauquelin, the master of Bellechasse, was a man in his early 50s, his lineage tracing back to the earliest French settlers of the territory. His features were sharp, his eyes a pale, calculating blue that seemed to miss nothing, yet revealed even less. He moved with a quiet, almost predatory grace, his mind perpetually occupied with ledgers, crop yields, and the intricate, often brutal mathematics of his enterprise. He was respected in the parish, a man of order and tradition, his word as solid as the cypress timbers of his house. But there was a coldness to Armand, an emotional distance that kept even his closest associates at arm's length. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and human lives, particularly those under his dominion, were often categorized in the latter. His wife, Adelaide Vauquelin, a woman in her late 40s, was a stark contrast. Born into a prominent family in South Carolina, she had been raised with a delicate sensibility, educated in literature and music, and imbued with a quiet, almost fragile piety. The opulence of Bellechasse, the sheer scale of its operations, and the inherent brutality of the system upon which it was built had always sat uneasily with her. Her days were spent managing the household, overseeing the domestic staff, and tending to her small, meticulously kept rose garden, a splash of vibrant color against the muted greens and browns of the plantation. She was a woman of deep, unspoken anxieties, her discomfort with her world manifesting in a perpetual, almost ethereal pallor, and a tendency to retreat into the quiet solitude of her thoughts. She yearned for a different life, a different time, but the currents of her existence were too strong to fight. Nettie, an enslaved woman in her early 30s, moved through the grand house with an almost invisible efficiency. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her eyes dark and intelligent, missing nothing that transpired within the Vauclin household. She was Armand's personal valet and Adelaide's most trusted domestic, a position that afforded her a unique, if precarious, vantage point. She knew the rhythms of the house, the unspoken tensions, the subtle shifts in mood that presaged trouble. Nettie was a woman of quiet strength, her observations sharp, her counsel, when sought, delivered with a wisdom born of necessity and survival. She was trusted, yes, but in that world, trust was a fragile commodity, always conditional, always shadowed by the ever-present threat of arbitrary power. Beyond the main house, stretching into the shimmering heat, lay the quarters of the enslaved community. Hundreds of souls toiled in the cane fields, their lives dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the demands of the crop, and the whims of their masters. It was a world within a world, a vibrant, resilient culture forged in hardship, with its own language, its own customs, its own hidden knowledge, passed down through generations. Whispers traveled faster than any horse, and secrets were guarded with a fierce, collective loyalty. Deputy Sheriff Thibodeau, a man in his 40s with a perpetually weary expression, was the local law. He was not overtly cruel, but he was a man of his time and place, deeply committed to maintaining the established order. His pragmatism often bordered on indifference, and his investigations rarely extended beyond the most superficial inquiries if they threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of power in the parish. He preferred quiet resolutions, even if they meant turning a blind eye to uncomfortable truths. Reverend Fenn, an itinerant Methodist preacher in his 60s, was a familiar, if somewhat eccentric figure at Bellechasse. He visited the plantation quarterly, holding services for both the Vauclin family and the enslaved community. His sermons a blend of fire and brimstone and quiet, compassionate counsel. He was a man of genuine faith, his eyes often holding a sadness that spoke of a deep understanding of human suffering. He saw more than most, and his quiet observations often held a weight that others dismissed. 4 months before the strange discovery, a young girl named Celeste, an enslaved child of approximately 7 or 8 years old, had gone missing from Bellechasse. Her disappearance had been handled with a chilling lack of urgency. Armand had simply noted it in his ledger as a loss, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of his operations. Adelaide had expressed a fleeting concern, a quiet prayer, but the demands of her life quickly overshadowed the memory of a child she barely knew. Among the enslaved community, however, Celeste's absence was a gaping wound. Whispers had circulated, sold south, some said, a common fate for children whose parents were deemed troublesome or whose labor was no longer profitable. Others spoke of a more sinister end, a quiet disappearance into the vast, indifferent landscape. But no one had truly searched. No official report had been filed beyond Armand's ledger. Celeste had simply vanished, swallowed by the insatiable maw of the plantation system, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease, a shadow that stretched across the sun-drenched fields of Bellechasse. And then the sounds began. Faint at first, easily dismissed as the scuttling of rats or the settling of old timbers. But they grew, slowly, persistently, until they became undeniable, a rhythmic scratching, a soft, almost melodic hum, emanating from the very earth beneath the house, a sound that promised to shatter the fragile peace of Bellechasse and reveal a truth far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The sounds began subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching that Nettie first noticed while polishing the silver in the dining room. It was a rhythmic, insistent whisper, like tiny claws dragging across rough wood, or perhaps a small creature burrowing. She dismissed it initially, attributing it to the usual nocturnal symphony of an old house. Rats in the walls, the wind playing tricks with loose shutters, the creaking of ancient beams. But as the days bled into a week, the scratching grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was no longer random. It had a pattern, a soft, almost rhythmic cadence, sometimes accompanied by a faint, high-pitched hum, like a child's lullaby, sung through a thick blanket. Nettie mentioned it to Adelaide, her voice carefully neutral. "Mistress, there's a peculiar sound beneath the house, near the dining room. Been hearing it for days now." Adelaide, preoccupied with a wilting rosebush, waved a dismissive hand. "Likely just field mice, Nettie. The heat brings them in. Have one of the boys set traps." Armand, when informed, merely grunted, his eyes still fixed on a column of figures in his ledger. "Nonsense. The foundations are solid. It's the wind, woman, or your imagination." He had no patience for such trivialities, especially when the sugar prices were fluctuating. But the sounds persisted, growing bolder, more insistent. At night, in the oppressive stillness of the house, they became undeniable. Adelaide, usually a sound sleeper, found herself lying awake, straining to hear, her heart quickening with each faint scratch, each ghostly hum. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a persistent, unsettling vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth beneath her home. She imagined things, dark, slithering things burrowing deeper, closer. The thought made her skin crawl. Finally, after nearly 10 days of this auditory torment, Adelaide confronted Armand with a rare flash of desperation. "Armand, I cannot sleep. There is something beneath the house. It is not mice, it is different." Her voice was thin, reedy with exhaustion and fear. Armand, annoyed by her persistence, sighed dramatically. "Very well, Adelaide. I will investigate this phantom menace myself. But I warn you, if it is merely a family of opossums, I shall expect you to apologize for disturbing my sleep." That night, a humid, moonless night where the air hung thick and still, Armand Vauquelin, lantern in hand, descended into the crawl space beneath Bellechasse. The entrance was a small wooden hatch near the back of the house, usually covered by a heavy stone. As he lifted it, a wave of cool, damp air, heavy with the scent of rich black earth and decaying vegetation, wafted up. He lowered himself into the narrow opening, the lantern casting dancing shadows that stretched and contorted the ancient cypress piers supporting the house. The crawl space was a labyrinth of darkness and dampness. The ground was a mixture of packed earth and mud, slick in places, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly animal yet not entirely unpleasant. Spiderwebs, thick and glistening, brushed against his face, and the occasional scuttling sound of unseen creatures echoed in the oppressive silence. Armand, a man of order and control, felt a rare tremor of unease. This was the wild, untamed underbelly of his meticulously ordered world. He moved slowly, carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The lantern beam cut through the gloom, illuminating roots that snaked like ancient serpents and the rough, unfinished undersides of the floorboards above. He reached the area directly beneath the dining room, the source of the persistent sounds. He paused, holding his breath, listening, and then he heard it. Not scratching, not humming, but a faint, almost imperceptible thump, 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 like a tiny muffled heartbeat. It was coming from directly beneath the floorboards, just a few feet from where he stood. He raised the lantern, its light piercing the deepest shadows. And there, huddled in a small scooped-out hollow in the earth, nestled between two massive cypress piers, was a child. She was small, impossibly small, her body curled into a tight ball, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her hair, a tangled mass of dark, matted curls, was streaked with mud and dust, obscuring much of her face. Her skin, a pale dark complexion, was grimy, But beneath the dirt, it held a translucent quality, as if she hadn't seen true sunlight in months. Her clothes were rags, indistinguishable in the dim light, but they seemed to be made of coarse, homespun cotton. As the lantern light fell upon her, she slowly, deliberately uncurled. Her head lifted, and two enormous dark eyes, wide and unblinking, met Armand's gaze. They were eyes that held no fear, no surprise, no recognition, only a profound, ancient stillness, reflecting the lantern light like polished obsidian. Around her in the small hollow were a few crude handmade items, a small chipped clay cup half buried in the earth, a piece of torn fabric, faded and worn, but with a faint pattern still visible, and clutched in her small dirt-caked hand, a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in silent flight. She did not cry out, she did not flinch, she did not attempt to scramble away. She simply sat there, utterly silent, utterly still, her dark eyes fixed on Armand, a living, breathing enigma in the suffocating darkness beneath Bellechasse. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic pounding of Armand's own heart. He had come expecting rats, perhaps a stray dog. He had found something far more terrifying. A child, living alone in the dark, beneath his very feet, a silent testament to a truth he could not yet comprehend. The morning after the discovery dawned with a brutal, unyielding heat, but the air inside Bellechasse felt colder than a winter's night. The child, still silent, was brought into the house, her small, dirt-caked form a stark contrast to the polished mahogany and gleaming brass. Nettie, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion, had gently washed the child, revealing skin the color of warm honey, marred by faint scratches and insect bites. Her hair, once matted, was now a soft, dark cloud around a face that was surprisingly delicate, though gaunt. Her eyes, still enormous and dark, seemed to absorb all light, reflecting nothing but a profound, unnerving emptiness. Adelaide, upon seeing the child in the harsh light of day, gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. The child was clearly malnourished, her limbs thin, her belly slightly distended. But it was the eyes that truly disturbed her. They held the wisdom of ages, yet the innocence of a creature untouched by human interaction. Armand, for his part, maintained a rigid composure, his jaw tight. He had sent a rider for Dr. Prout, the local physician, a man known for his pragmatic approach to all ailments, physical or otherwise. Dr. Prout arrived an hour later, a portly man in his 50s with a perpetually skeptical expression and a medical bag that smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale tobacco. He examined the child with a clinical detachment, his fingers probing her small frame, his stethoscope pressed against her tiny chest. He noted her rapid, shallow breathing, the faint tremor in her hands, the dullness of her reflexes. Malnutrition, certainly, he pronounced, his voice gruff, and likely some form of sensory deprivation. She's been living in darkness, I'd wager. Perhaps for months. He carefully avoided speculating on how she came to be there or why no one had noticed. His job was to diagnose the physical, not the moral. He prescribed a regimen of small, frequent meals, rich broths, and plenty of fresh water. He also suggested quiet, gentle interaction, though he doubted it would yield much. She's like a wild thing, Mrs. Vauclin, he observed, wiping his hands on a linen cloth. Needs to be coaxed back to the world. The child, true to Dr. Prout's assessment, would not speak. She ate when food was placed before her, consuming it with a quiet intensity, her eyes never leaving the person who offered it. She watched everything, her gaze following every movement, every flicker of emotion on the faces around her. She made no sound, not a whimper, not a sigh. She simply existed, a silent observer in a world that was suddenly, bewilderingly, full of light and noise. Adelaide, despite her initial shock, found herself drawn to the child. She would sit with her for hours in the parlor, reading aloud from her favorite novels, her voice soft and melodic. The child would listen, her dark eyes fixed on Adelaide's face, though whether she understood a single word was impossible to tell. Adelaide would brush her hair, gently comb out the tangles, and the child would allow it, her body still, almost pliant. There was a profound loneliness in the child's silence that resonated with Adelaide's own unspoken isolation. Deputy Sheriff Thibodeau arrived later that afternoon, his face grim. Armand had sent for him, hoping for a swift, discreet resolution. Thibodeau questioned Armand, then Adelaide, his questions circling the obvious. Who is she? Where did she come from? How long was she there? Armand offered vague answers, insisting he had no idea, that she must have wandered onto the property. Thibodeau, a man who knew the rhythms of the parish, found this explanation unsatisfying. A child living beneath a house for months, unnoticed. It strained credulity. He then attempted to question the child, kneeling before her, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Little one, can you tell me your name? Where are your mama and papa?" The child merely stared, her dark eyes unblinking, her silence absolute. Thibodeau sighed, running a hand over his tired face. This was going to be complicated. If this story is already getting under your skin, good. That means we're doing our job. Before we continue, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps us keep making stories like this one. And leave a comment. What do you think was really happening at Bellechasse? We want to hear your theories. Now, back to 1858. It was Nettie, while carefully folding the child's few rags, who made the crucial discovery. Among the tattered remnants of what might have once been a dress, she found a small, triangular piece of fabric carefully tucked into a seam. It was a vibrant blue cotton, patterned with tiny white flowers, a distinctive print that Nettie recognized instantly. Her breath hitched in her throat. She knew that fabric. She had seen it before. It was from a dress that had belonged to Celeste. The same Celeste who had gone missing 4 months ago, supposedly sold south. Nettie's hands trembled as she held the fabric, her mind racing. If this child had Celeste's dress, what did that mean? Was this Celeste? No, the child was too small, too young. Celeste had been older, perhaps 8. This child looked no older than 5, perhaps 6. But the fabric was undeniable. It was a thread, fragile yet strong, connecting the silent child beneath the floor to the vanished girl, Celeste, and to a truth that Bellechasse had desperately tried to bury. Reverend Fenn arrived at Bellechasse for his quarterly visit a week after the child's discovery, his worn leather Bible clutched in his hand, his eyes already holding that familiar, sorrowful gaze. He was a man who saw the world through a lens of quiet suffering, and the atmosphere at Bellechasse, usually one of strained politeness, now thrummed with an almost palpable tension. He greeted Armand and Adelaide, his questions about their health met with clipped, evasive answers. It was Nettie, her face carefully impassive, who led him to the parlor where the child sat, silent and watchful, in a large armchair. The moment Reverend Fenn's eyes fell upon the child, a flicker of profound recognition, then a deep, aching sorrow crossed his face. He knelt before her, his gnarled hand reaching out, then hesitating. "Little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You have Celeste's eyes." He looked up at Adelaide, his gaze piercing. "This child, she reminds me so much of Celeste. The way she holds herself, the quietness." Adelaide, flustered, explained the circumstances of the child's discovery, omitting, of course, the piece of fabric. Reverend Fenn listened, his expression growing graver with each word. He had known Celeste well. Unlike many, he had seen beyond her status, recognizing a sharp, inquisitive mind. In secret, during his visits, he had been teaching her to read and write, using passages from the Bible as their primer. Celeste had been a quick study, her small fingers tracing letters with an eager intensity, her mind absorbing knowledge like a sponge. She had been a bright, curious spark in a world that sought to dim all such lights. Through the fragmented accounts of Nettie and others in the enslaved community, a clearer, yet more disturbing picture of Celeste began to emerge. Celeste had been a child of unusual perception. She had a knack for noticing things, for piecing together disparate observations. She spent much of her time in the main house, running errands, helping Nettie, and often simply observing. She had a particular fascination with the papers Armand Vauquelin kept in his study. She would often see him poring over ledgers, his brow furrowed, his pen scratching across the pages. Nettie recalled Celeste asking her once, "Nettie, why does Master Armand write so many numbers? And why do some of the numbers not match the people?" Nettie had dismissed it, telling Celeste not to concern herself with Master's business, a warning born of fear. But Celeste, it seemed, had not heeded the warning. She had begun to ask questions. Quiet, innocent questions, but questions that, in the context of Bellechasse, were dangerous. She had noticed discrepancies, small inconsistencies in the records she glimpsed, particularly concerning the movement of enslaved people and the corresponding financial entries. She had seen a specific ledger, bound in dark leather, that Armand kept locked in his desk. A ledger she had once seen him consult with a man from New Orleans, their voices low and urgent. The night Celeste disappeared, 3 other things had happened simultaneously. Events that at the time seemed unrelated, but now, in the shadow of the silent child, took on a chilling significance. First, a small but valuable silver locket belonging to Adelaide had gone missing from her dressing table. Adelaide had been distraught, accusing one of the house servants, though no one had confessed, and the locket was never found. Second, a particularly fierce storm had swept through the parish, bringing torrential rains and high winds, knocking out power and felling several ancient trees near the river. The chaos of the storm had provided a perfect cover for any clandestine activity. And third, a new overseer, a man named Silas Croft, known for his brutal efficiency and unquestioning loyalty to Armand, had arrived at Bellechasse, replacing the previous more lenient overseer who had suddenly and without explanation been dismissed. The confluence of these events, a missing locket, a violent storm, a new ruthless overseer, now seemed less like coincidence and more like a carefully orchestrated sequence, designed to obscure a far darker truth. Celeste, it seemed, had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see, something that Armand Vauquelin was desperate to keep hidden. And the silent child, with Celeste's eyes and Celeste's fabric, was the living, breathing proof of that terrible secret. The discovery of the child and the unsettling implications of Celeste's fabric had cast a long, cold shadow over Bellechasse. Adelaide, usually a creature of habit, found her routines disrupted, her thoughts consumed by the silent girl who now occupied a small room off the kitchen. The child, whom Adelaide had tentatively named Lily, a name that seemed to suit her delicate, almost ethereal presence, remained mute, her dark eyes observing everything with an unnerving intensity. One sweltering afternoon, with Armand away in Baton Rouge on plantation business and the house staff occupied with the endless chores of a grand estate, Adelaide found herself alone in the vast, echoing silence of Bellechasse. A strange, almost magnetic pull drew her towards Armand's private study, a room she had rarely entered, a sanctuary of ledgers and documents that had always felt forbidden. It was a space that embodied Armand's cold, calculating world, a world she had always instinctively recoiled from. But now, a desperate, gnawing curiosity, fueled by the silent child and the ghost of Celeste, propelled her forward. The study was exactly as Armand left it, meticulously organized, the air thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on agriculture, law, and economics. A large, heavy mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear, save for a silver inkwell, a quill pen, and a stack of neatly bound papers. Adelaide's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. She knew Armand kept his most important documents, his most sensitive records, in a locked drawer. She tried the top drawer first. Locked. Then the second. Also locked. A wave of despair washed over her. How could she find anything? Then her gaze fell upon a small, ornate silver key, half hidden beneath a stack of financial reports on a side table. Armand was usually so meticulous. Had he forgotten it? Or had he, in his haste, simply overlooked it? A shiver ran down her spine. It felt less like an oversight and more like a deliberate, almost taunting invitation. With a deep, shaky breath, Adelaide picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in her palm. She returned to the desk and with a soft click, the third drawer slid open. Inside, nestled amongst other documents, lay a single dark, leather-bound ledger. It was thicker, older, and more worn than the others she had seen Armand consult. This was it. This was the ledger Celeste had glimpsed, the one that held the numbers that didn't match. Adelaide pulled it out, her hands clammy. The leather was smooth and cool beneath her fingertips. She opened it, and the faint, musty scent of aged paper filled her nostrils. The pages were filled with Armand's precise, elegant script, columns of figures, dates, and names. But these weren't just names of crops or supplies. These were names of people. And next to many of them, chillingly, were dates of acquisition and disposition. She began to read, her eyes scanning the entries, her breath catching in her throat. There were records of sales, of purchases, of transfers to other plantations. But then she saw entries that made her blood run cold. Names, followed by dates, and then, instead of a sale price or a new location, cryptic notations, lost to fever, runaway, presumed deceased, disappeared, no trace. And beneath these, often, a small, almost imperceptible financial adjustment, a quiet write-off. It was the horror of paperwork, of accounting, of a system so normalized that human lives and their sudden, unexplained cessation were recorded with the same dispassionate precision as a damaged tool or a failed crop. Her gaze fell upon a specific entry, dated 4 months prior. Celeste. Next to the name, not sold to Mr. Dubois or transferred to Evergreen Plantation, but simply disappeared. No trace. Value adjusted. And then a small, almost imperceptible symbol, a tiny hand-drawn bird, identical to the one the silent child clutched. Adelaide's eyes darted back to the previous page. There, beneath another disappeared entry, was the same small bird. And another. And another. It wasn't a symbol of loss, she realized with a sickening lurch. It was a symbol of disposal, a quiet, efficient way to erase a life, to make it disappear from the ledgers, from the world. And the financial adjustments, the value-adjusted notations were not for losses but for gains, the quiet, untraceable profits from lives that simply vanished. Then, her eyes caught something else, tucked into the very back of the ledger, almost hidden. It was a small folded piece of paper, not Armand's neat script, but a child's crude, hesitant drawing. It depicted a stick figure, small and alone, beneath a large, looming house. And in the corner of the drawing, almost like a signature, was the same tiny, hand-carved wooden bird that the silent child, Lily, now held. Adelaide didn't take anything. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking too violently. She carefully placed the drawing back in the ledger, closed the dark leather cover, and returned it to the locked drawer. She replaced the key beneath the financial reports, her movements precise, almost mechanical. She closed the study door behind her, the click of the latch echoing in the silent house. That evening, she sat at the dinner table, the grand dining room bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Armand, returned from Baton Rouge, spoke of sugar prices and new machinery. Adelaide listened, her gaze distant. She passed the butter to him, her fingers brushing his, and she felt a profound, chilling revulsion. She looked at his cold, calculating eyes, his precise movements, and she knew. She knew what he was, and she knew that she would never look at him the same way again. The horror was not in the screams, but in the silence, in the ledger, in the quiet, efficient erasure of lives, and in the small, hand-carved bird that connected the vanished Celeste to the silent child beneath the floor. Just when we thought we understood what was happening at Belchasse Plantation, the horror deepens. And it's not the kind that screams. It's the kind that whispers. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, and hit that like button so we know you're here with us. We have a lot more to reveal. The silent child, Lily, remained a mystery to all but Adelaide. Days turned into weeks and still, no sound escaped her lips. Dr. Prout's gentle coaxing, Nettie's patient care, Reverend Fenn's soft hymns, nothing elicited a spoken word. Yet her eyes, those enormous dark pools of ancient stillness, missed nothing. Adelaide, in a moment of quiet inspiration, offered Lily a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper. The child took them, her small fingers closing around the charcoal with an almost desperate grip. And then, she began to draw. She drew with the ferocity and focus of someone trying to say everything they could not say out loud, her small hand moving with a surprising certainty. Over the course of 2 weeks, she produced 8 drawings, each one a revelation, each one answering one question and raising 3 more. They were crude, innocent, drawn with the simple lines of a child, yet their content was devastating. The first drawing was of a large, looming house, its columns stark and white, its windows dark and empty. Beneath the house, a small, curled figure, almost indistinguishable from the shadows. It was Belchasse, seen from below, from the perspective of the crawl space. The second drawing depicted a woman, tall and slender with long, flowing hair. Her face was indistinct, but her hands were outstretched, as if reaching or pleading. Next to her, a smaller figure, a child, with the same distinctive dark matted curls as Lily. This, Adelaide realized with a jolt, was Celeste, and perhaps her mother or another woman who had cared for her. The third drawing was more abstract, a series of dark, swirling lines like a storm. Within the storm, faint outlines of trees falling, and a small, terrified face peering out from behind a thick root. It was the night Celeste disappeared, the night of the great storm, seen through the eyes of a child hiding beneath the house. The fourth drawing was chilling in its simplicity. It showed a man, tall and imposing, his face a blank oval, but his hand holding a small, dark object. Next to him another figure, smaller, with a distinctive, cruel sneer. This was Silas Croft, the new overseer, and the blank-faced man could only be Armand. The dark object in Armand's hand was ambiguous, but the implication was clear. The fifth drawing was a series of numbers, crudely scrawled, but recognizable as figures. Beneath them, a small, hand-drawn bird, identical to the one Lily clutched, and the one Adelaide had seen in Armand's ledger. It was Celeste's attempt to communicate the numbers she had seen, the discrepancies she had noticed, the financial adjustments that marked a life erased. The sixth drawing was perhaps the most disturbing. It showed a small open box, and inside it, not a treasure, but a dark, indistinct shape. Above the box, a hand dropping something into it, and around the box, several small, dark figures, like shadows, watching. It was a depiction of something being hidden, something being buried, something being disposed of. The seventh drawing was of a locket, small and silver, with a distinctive engraving. It was Adelaide's locket, the one that had gone missing the night Celeste disappeared. The child had seen it, had witnessed its disappearance, and now, through her art, she was revealing its fate. The eighth and final drawing was a stark, almost brutal image. A small figure, curled in a ball, beneath the floorboards of a house. But this time, above the house, a single, enormous eye, wide open, watching. It was the child's self-portrait, a testament to her existence, her silent vigil, her profound, terrifying witness. Adelaide, her heart aching, laid the drawings out on the parlor table. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that these were not mere childish scribbles. They were a testimony, a silent confession, a horrifying narrative told through charcoal and paper. Armand returned from Baton Rouge that evening, his mood sour from a difficult negotiation. He entered the parlor, expecting to find Adelaide engaged in her usual quiet pursuits. Instead, he found her standing over the table, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the drawings. He approached, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "What is this, Adelaide? More of the child's nonsense?" His voice died in his throat as his eyes fell upon the images. The house from below, the storm, the numbers, the locket, and finally, the enormous watching eye. His face, usually so composed, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Where did she get these ideas?" he roared, his voice echoing through the silent house. "Who has been filling her head with such fabrications?" Adelaide met his gaze, her own eyes, usually so timid, now burning with a quiet, fierce resolve. "She drew what she saw, Armand, what she witnessed, what you did." The confrontation was brutal, a clash of wills that had been simmering beneath the surface of their marriage for years. Armand denied everything, his denials growing more frantic, more desperate, as Adelaide calmly pointed to each drawing, explaining its horrifying significance. He accused her of madness, of succumbing to the superstitions of the enslaved. But Adelaide held firm, her voice steady, her conviction unwavering. She knew, and he knew that she knew. The next day, Deputy Sheriff Thibodeau returned to Bellechasse, summoned by a terse note from Armand. He found Armand pacing the parlor, his face flushed, his eyes wild. Adelaide sat quietly, the drawings neatly stacked beside her. Thibodeau, a man who preferred to avoid unpleasantness, listened to Armand's agitated accusations against Adelaide, then turned his gaze to the drawings. His weary eyes scanned each image, and a slow, dawning comprehension spread across his face. He recognized the locket. He recognized the crude depiction of Silas Croft, a man he knew to be ruthless. He recognized the numbers, the chilling simplicity of the disappeared entries. He looked at Armand, then at Adelaide, then back at the drawings. The silence in the room was deafening. Before Thibodeau could speak, a carriage rumbled up the drive. Two stern-faced men, dressed in dark suits, emerged. They were from Baton Rouge, sent by Armand's powerful associates, men who had a vested interest in maintaining the delicate balance of power and the quiet flow of commerce in the parish. Their arrival was a clear message. This matter was to be handled discreetly, efficiently, and without scandal. But Reverend Fenn, who had been quietly observing the unfolding drama, had already acted. While the household was consumed by the confrontations, he had taken the opportunity to make careful, precise copies of each of Lily's drawings, sketching them onto sheets of paper he kept sewn into the lining of his worn traveling coat. He knew, with a certainty born of faith and experience, that these drawings were more than just a child's art. They were a truth that needed to be preserved, a voice that needed to be heard, even if it had to wait for a time when the world was ready to listen. The arrival of the men from Baton Rouge signaled the beginning of the long silence that would descend upon Bellechasse. They were not lawmen in the traditional sense, but agents of influence, their purpose to suppress any burgeoning scandal that might threaten the delicate economic and social order of the parish. Deputy Sheriff Thibodeau, a man who understood the unspoken rules of his world, was quietly persuaded to close his investigation. The official report would state that the child, Lily, was a runaway from a neighboring plantation, suffering from amnesia, and that Celeste had indeed been sold south, her whereabouts unknown. The drawings were dismissed as the confused imaginings of a traumatized child. The truth, however, was far more insidious. Lily, the silent child, was quietly removed from Bellechasse. Her destination was never officially recorded. Some whispered she was sent to an orphanage in New Orleans, others that she was taken by a distant relative of Adelaide's, far from the prying eyes of Louisiana. What became of her, whether she ever spoke, whether she ever found peace, remained one of Belchasse's many unanswered questions, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape of the past. Adelaide Vauclin, however, made a decision that cost her everything and saved something else. The confrontation with Armand, the chilling revelations of the ledger and the drawings, had shattered the fragile illusion of her life. She could no longer live in the house of secrets, under the shadow of a man she now saw as a monster. Within weeks of Lily's removal, Adelaide announced her intention to leave Bellechasse, citing ill health and a need for spiritual solace. She moved to a small, quiet cottage in Charleston, South Carolina, her childhood home, taking with her only a few personal effects and a profound, unshakable sorrow. She never spoke of Bellechasse again, but in her quiet acts of charity, in her tireless work with orphaned children, there was a silent testament to the truth she carried within her. She saved her own soul, but the cost was her marriage, her home, and her peace of mind. Armand Vauquelin remained at Bellechasse, outwardly untouched by the events. The men from Baton Rouge ensured that no official charges were ever brought, no public accusations ever made. But the long, quiet dissolution of the man had begun. The cold, calculating precision that had once defined him slowly eroded. He became more withdrawn, his eyes haunted, his once impeccable ledgers now occasionally marred by errors, by numbers that refused to balance. The silence of Adelaide's departure, the ghost of Celeste, and the memory of Lily's enormous watching eyes gnawed at him. He was never confronted, never charged, never named in any official record, but the silence, the unspoken knowledge, became his prison. Bellechasse, once his empire, became his tomb. He died a decade later, a lonely, embittered man, his fortune diminished, his legacy tainted by whispers that never quite faded. Nettie, a woman of quiet resilience, carried her own truths. In 1863, amidst the chaos of the Civil War, she seized an opportunity and left Bellechasse, making her way to New Orleans. She found work as a laundress, her sharp mind and observant nature serving her well in the bustling city. She never spoke of the secrets of Bellechasse, but the memory of Celeste and the silent child remained etched in her heart, a quiet sorrow she carried with her until her dying day. Reverend Fenn, however, refused to let the truth be entirely buried. He continued his itinerant preaching, his sermons growing more impassioned, more focused on justice and the inherent dignity of every soul. He kept the copied drawings, carefully preserved, sewn into the lining of his coat, a silent promise. In 1871, an old man, his body failing, he lay on his deathbed in a small parsonage in rural Mississippi. He summoned a young man named Devereaux, a bright, earnest student at a Methodist seminary who had often assisted him. To Devereaux, Fenn entrusted a small, wooden box, worn smooth with age. Inside, carefully wrapped in linen, were the copied drawings of Lily, and 3 pages of Fenn's own meticulous handwritten testimony detailing the events at Bellechasse, the ledger, the disappearances, and the chilling implications. "These are not just drawings, son," Fenn had whispered, his voice raspy. "They are a voice, a truth that must one day be heard." Devereaux, a man of integrity and deep conviction, understood the weight of the trust placed upon him. He kept the box, guarding its contents with a fierce protectiveness. He studied the drawings, read Fenn's testimony, and understood the profound, human horror it represented. He knew that the time was not yet right, that the wounds of the war were too fresh, the desire for forgetting too strong. But he believed, as Fenn had, that truth, like water, would eventually find its way to the surface. He would spend his life quietly advocating for justice, for memory, for the voices that had been silenced, always keeping the box and its terrible contents safe. And Bellechasse itself? The grand house, once a symbol of wealth and power, slowly succumbed to the relentless embrace of the Louisiana wilderness. The sugarcane fields, once meticulously tended, became overgrown, reclaimed by the wild. The verandas sagged, the paint peeled, the columns crumbled. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay, not just of leaves and wood, but of forgotten dreams and buried truths. And beneath it all, the crawl space, dark and damp, was never used again. No one dared to venture into its depths, for it was known, in the quiet, unspoken language of the land, that it held not just the earth, but the echoes of a silent child, and the profound, terrifying truth of what lived and died beneath the floorboards of Belchas. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying things in history were never monsters under the bed. They were men at the dinner table and the silence of those who knew. What do you think?